The Drowned Choir. You're watching Unholy Casefiles, where we dive into the haunted corners of history and the unsolved mysteries that refuse to rest. We release 3 videos every week, each one pieced together like a case file, documents, testimonies, and whispers from the past stitched into a story that lingers. This one begins, as so many stories do, with something small, a song. On a summer night not long ago, 3 friends walked home from a riverside gathering. They were teenagers, half daring each other, half reluctant to leave the warmth of the fire behind. 2 of them would later give testimony to police. The third, 16-year-old Lee Montgomery, never made it home. They said she started humming as they reached the levee path. Not a pop tune, not anything from church, just a melody, soft and unfamiliar, running under her breath. When asked later to hum it themselves, the friends faltered. They remembered only fragments, a rising note, then something that fell away. They said it made their skin prickle, like hearing someone pray in a language you shouldn't understand. Lee stopped as she hummed, they said. She seemed dazed, her gaze fixed on the dark water glimmering under the street lamps. Then without a word she stepped off the path and down the slope toward the riverbank. The other 2 called after her. By the time they caught up, Lee was gone. No splash, no scream, no sign of a struggle. Just the steady lap of the river, black and featureless in the July night. Police divers searched for days. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Boats trawled the water, nothing. Lee's story is still listed as open, presumed drowned. But this story is not only about one girl. When we began researching Lee's disappearance, we noticed a pattern, a disturbing one. The people of St. Augustine Parish, a quiet Louisiana town tucked between sugar fields and river bends, have been losing someone to the water every 11 years. The records go back over a century. The pattern is neat, mathematical, uncanny, and every time the witnesses, whether a sibling, a friend, a fisherman casting his nets, report the same detail. The missing person was humming. Always humming. Always a song no one could name. Locals don't speak of it openly. They'll lower their voices if you ask. Some will shut the door in your face. But a few, a brave few, told us what they've heard on certain nights, when the river is swollen, when the moon sits low, and the fields are damp with fog. They hear singing, not one voice, but many, layered and indistinct. Like a hymn carried on the wind, it rises and falls in unison, with the rush of water against the banks. Sometimes it's faint, a trick of acoustics. Other times it's so clear that people swear they can pick out individual harmonies, as though a choir waits just beyond the bend in the river. And always, when you listen too closely, the voices seem to come from beneath the surface. This is the story of what locals call the Drowned Choir. It begins in 1912, on a storm-swept night that carved tragedy into the memory of this parish, a night when a church and its entire choir were swallowed by the river in a sudden flood. But it has never truly ended. And this story will open the old case files, newspaper clippings warped with age, parish records penned in fading ink, and waterlogged hymnals recovered from the mud. We'll hear from descendants who still carry the weight of silence, and from investigators, both skeptical and credulous, who tried to capture the voices on tape. And we'll return ourselves to the site where the chapel once stood, a place where the river still swells too quickly after storms, a place where locals swear the choir still sings. In Lee's case file, there's a note from a deputy who interviewed her two surviving friends. It's the sort of detail most reports would ignore, but it caught our attention. He wrote, "Both witnesses independently recalled the missing girl humming. Neither could place the tune, but both agreed it sounded church-like. One described it as a hymn I don't know, but that I almost remembered." That phrase, almost remembered, echoes through this investigation, because that is what the parishioners said in 1912 too, that the last hymn sung in the chapel that night was not one they recognized, and yet they all remembered it, or thought they did. A melody they could not name, but could not forget. The river runs quiet most nights in St. Augustine Parish, but there are times when it does not run alone, when the fog is heavy, when the lanterns by the levee sway. When you stop and listen, you can hear the echo of voices beneath the water. You may even find yourself humming along. The flood of 1912. The parish archives record the date as April 14th, 1912. The morning began with fair skies and the scent of rain in the distance. By afternoons, clouds gathered low and heavy over St. Augustine Parish. By nightfall, the storm broke. The rain came hard and sudden. Witnesses spoke of water spilling from the sky in sheets, so thick it was difficult to see across the road. The river, swollen from spring melt, rose faster than anyone expected. By 9 o'clock, its muddy surface had swallowed the low banks and begun creeping toward the wooden chapel that stood at the bend in the river. Inside the chapel, the Sunday choir practiced. It was an old wooden structure, no more than 40 feet long, with thin walls and narrow windows. Lightning flashed through the stained glass, casting fractured reds and blues across the pews, but the congregation sang on. The parish ledger lists at least 27 names present that night, men, women, and children, some as young as 10. Their voices were recorded as clear and jubilant in the accounts that survived. No one realized the river was already pressing against the foundation. Survivor testimonies. Only 3 people lived to tell what happened inside. One, a farmer named Elijah Cole, had stepped outside to check his wagon when he saw the water surging across the road. He ran back, shouting for the choir to flee, but the doors resisted his pull. It was as if the building itself held them in, he told a reporter weeks later. And they were still singing, I swear it. They sang while the water pounded the walls. Another, Sarah Dean, a young girl who escaped through a side window, remembered the hymn itself. It wasn't one I knew, not from our book, but they sang it with such strength, like they had always known it. It chased me as I ran, and it never stopped. The third, a deacon's wife named Margaret Walsh, survived by clinging to an uprooted tree. She later said she heard the voices for long moments after the roof collapsed. They didn't scream, she insisted. They sang. The collapse. Sometime after 10 o'clock, the chapel gave way. The river tore through its walls like paper, sweeping choirs and pews alike into the current. Lightning struck again, and those watching from the safety of the bluff swore they saw candles still burning as the structure slid under. In the morning, only fragments remained. Boards tangled in branches, a half-submerged pulpit, scattered hymnals drifting in eddies. Bodies were recovered for days, pulled from sandbars miles downstream. The official count stood at 27, though some insisted more had been present. Visitors, unrecorded children. The ledger is inconsistent, names ink smeared from water damage. The folklore began. By summer, stories circulated of the last hymn. Parishioners who had not been present swore they heard the singing from their homes as the storm raged. A hymn carried on the wind, strange but irresistible. Children hummed the melody without knowing where it came from. Farmers heard it above the hiss of rain on their roofs, and when asked to reproduce it, each recalled something different. A rising line, a minor refrain, a wordless hymn. What bound the stories together was the conviction that the voices had continued after the church was gone. The St. Augustine Gazette printed a cautious piece 2 weeks after the tragedy. Several townsfolk claim the final song of the drowned choir lingered on the air long after the waters claimed them. This paper hesitates to endorse such notions, but acknowledges the sincerity of the witnesses. From that moment, the tragedy began to shift from history into legend. The artifacts. In June, when the river finally receded, locals discovered fragments of hymnals caught in tree roots and washed into ditches. The paper was warped and blackened with silt, most pages illegible, but one volume, kept today in the Parish Historical Society, preserved a single page intact. It bore a hymn not found in any other hymnal of the time. The title is smudged beyond recognition, but the notes remain, a simple progression, rising and falling like the swell of water. Musicologists, who later described it as hauntingly incomplete, as though a measure is missing. Even stranger, parishioners claim they remember hearing the melody in 1912, though none had ever seen it printed before. To this day, no other copy of the hymn has surfaced. The lasting memory. The flood of 1912 entered official history as an act of God, a sudden storm, an unprepared parish, a tragic loss of life. But in the memory of St. Augustine, it became something else. The survivors' testimonies, the eerie reports of singing carried on the storm, and the single warped hymnal created the foundation of a story that still grips the town more than a century later. Because if the voices really did carry on after the river took them, if the hymn was not of their own making, then perhaps the choir never stopped singing. And if that's true, then what happened to Lee Montgomery more than 100 years later may not have been the first time the river called someone home. The first pattern. The story of the drowned choir might have ended in 1912, sealed off as a tragedy of weather and bad luck, if not for what came next. 11 years later, the cycle began. 1923, The Farmhand. The parish newspaper dated August 3rd, 1923, records a brief article under Local News. It was easy to miss. Missing George Avery, age 19, farmhand employed at the Mason farm, was last seen near Willow Creek on Sunday evening. He failed to return to his lodges that night. A pair of work boots were discovered on the creek's edge. Search efforts continue. George was not remarkable, by most accounts, a quiet young man who worked hard and kept to himself. He was walking home from the fields at night, carrying his tools, when neighbors last saw him. They say he paused on the bridge over Willow Creek, rested his load, and began to hum. Not a song from the radio, not one from church, something else. The boots were found neatly placed by the water. His tools were stacked beside them. George himself was never recovered. A deputy's note, buried in parish archives, reads, Witness said humming was strange, like church, but not church. 1934. The schoolteacher. 11 years passed. The parish prospered. The flood and its choir were rarely mentioned. People spoke instead of crops, road repairs, and the growing automobile trade. Then, in 1934, the pattern repeated. Miss Caroline Peters, a 27-year-old schoolteacher, failed to appear for class one morning. At first, it was assumed she had taken ill, but when her rooming house landlord checked, her bed had not been slept in. Later, a fisherman reported seeing her walking along the levee at dawn, head tilted, lips moving. She was humming something, like she was remembering an old song, he told police. I thought maybe she'd lost her mind. Her hat was found tangled in reeds. No body was ever recovered. The Gazette's coverage was more expensive this time, but still cautious. The parish grieves the unexplained loss of a beloved educator. While local rumors abound, this paper urges prayer, not speculation. 1945. The soldier. The war ended in Europe that year, and families welcomed their sons home. Among them was Private Daniel Ross, 22, who had served overseas. 10 days after his return, Daniel vanished. His parents told investigators that he'd grown restless, walking at night, humming to himself. They recognized none of the melodies. Not military, his father insisted. Not hymns either. Something else. Something that didn't sit right. One friend recalled Daniel saying he heard singing at the edge of sleep, like the choir back home. When asked what he meant, he grew silent. Daniel was last seen near the parish ferry landing. Only his jacket remained, folded neatly on the dock. A parish map, drawn by hand and preserved in sheriff records, shows an X by the ferry dock with the note, Humming reported, last seen here. 1956. The child. By 1956, enough whispers had spread that families were careful. Parents warned children not to wander near the river. Ministers spoke vaguely of temptation, urging their flock to keep to prayer when storms came. But the cycle did not break. That July, Elizabeth Moran, age 12, disappeared while playing by the creek near her home. Her sister told police that Elizabeth had been humming a tune while skipping stones. She said it was stuck in her head, the girl testified. She said she didn't know where she heard it. Her shoes were discovered side by side in the grass. The search involved dozens of neighbors, dogs, and lanterns. Nothing was ever found. Elizabeth's disappearance tore the silence wide open. Families whispered of the flood in hushed tones. Some said the children lost in 1912 had never rested. Others said the river demanded its due. But official voices urged restraint. The parish pastor delivered a sermon titled, Against Idle Fancies. He warned against superstition, urging prayer and the rejection of old wives' tales. The pattern emerges. By the late 1950s, 4 unexplained vanishings, spaced 11 years apart, left a mark on the community. Each case shared eerie similarities. Proximity to water, belongings left behind, neatly arranged. Witnesses recalled humming, always an unfamiliar hymn. But officially, there was no connection. Each was treated as an isolated tragedy. Sheriff notes reveal quiet frustration. Too many years between to establish any link. Families unwilling to speak freely. Privately, however, townsfolk began to see the cycle. Some marked calendars. Others whispered that the 11th year is the dangerous one. Parents kept children close, especially near the anniversary of the flood. The silence of the community. The parish developed a culture of silence. Families discouraged questions. Survivors of the flood refused interviews, and ministers, decade after decade, preached the same refrain: pray, don't investigate. One retired pastor, interviewed late in life, admitted more plainly, if you stir up the past, it stirs you back. The town learned to look away. Folklore hardens. By the 1960s, children told campfire stories about the drowned choir. Some dared each other to hum the river hymn by the chapel ruins, claiming the voices would answer back. Farmers avoided the floodplain at dusk, and yet every so often, someone swore they heard it, the sound of layered voices riding on the fog. The Gazette largely ignored the subject. The few times it did print rumors, they appeared in cautious language. A number of parishioners claimed to have heard music at night along the river, though no source could be identified. The paper advises against indulgence in fantasy. Still, the folklore grew. Each disappearance was folded into the legend, whether the papers acknowledged it or not. Building the case file. Looking back now, through parish ledgers and brittle clippings, the first pattern is unmistakable. From George Avery in 1923 to Elizabeth Moran in 1956, the rhythm is relentless. 11 years, always by water, always the song. At the time, these were only scattered tragedies, painful but unlinked. Yet the silences of the community, the whispered warnings, and the private notes of deputies and pastors tells another story, a story of something unfinished. The drowned were not done singing. The river was not done listening. The witnesses. By the mid-20th century, the pattern of disappearance had etched itself into the fabric of St. Augustine Parish, whether people admitted it or not. Families warned children about the river. Ministers counseled prayer, but the silences were punctuated by voices, witnesses who claimed to have seen or heard what others could not. Some testimonies were clear and consistent. Others contradicted themselves or bent under the weight of fear, but taken together, they form a chorus, fragmented, discordant, yet undeniably there. He kept humming in his sleep. In a taped interview from the 1980s, preserved in the Parish Historical Society's oral history collection, an elderly woman named Anne Moran spoke haltingly about her younger sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth had been the child who vanished in 1956, the shoes by the creek, the sister left behind. Anne recalled that in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Elizabeth had changed. She hummed in her sleep, Anne said. I shared a bed with her, and I remember waking up because it was so soft, right in my ear. It wasn't any song I knew. Mama would ask, and Lizzie would just shrug, say she didn't remember. But the sound, it was like she wasn't just humming, like others were humming with her, right under the floorboards. Anne paused. On the tape you can hear her crying softly, decades later. The night before she went missing, she sat up in bed, eyes wide open. She hummed aloud, louder than I'd ever heard her. I shook her, and she just kept going, like she was answering something, and the next day. Anne never finished that sentence. The Fisherman, 1967. Not every story centers on the lost. Some come from those who narrowly escaped. One of the most cited testimonies belongs to Henri Boudreau, a fisherman who gave his account in 1967. He was hauling nets on the river before dawn when a fog descended, thick and sudden. I heard them, he told deputies afterward. Not one, not two, Dozens. Voices layered like a choir, coming across the water. At first I thought it was folks on the bank, but the nets went still. No fish. Just silence, except for that singing. Then the boat rocked hard, like something big passed under it, nearly tipped me over. Henry pulled his nets to find them shredded, ropes frayed like they'd been cut from beneath. He refused to fish that stretch again. His sons sold the boat within the year. Children in white robes. Other testimonies blur the line between memory and nightmare. In the 1970s, several parish residents claimed to see children near the riverbanks at night, always in white, always barefoot. Some described them as singing. Others said they stood silently, staring. One account, from a woman named Joanne Keller, appeared in a regional magazine. I was driving home one night when I saw them on the levee, maybe 8 or 9 children, standing in a line. They wore white robes, like a choir. I slowed down, rolled down my window, but when I blinked, they were gone. Not scattered, not running, just gone. Skeptics dismiss the stories as tricks of fog, imagination fueled by folklore. But the image of robed children became part of the parish's whispered lore, an echo of the choir that drowned in 1912. Contradictions, of course. Not all witnesses agreed. Some flatly denied ever hearing or seeing anything unusual. A 1975 sheriff's note reads, interviewed 3 witnesses along Willow Creek. 2 claimed strange singing. 3rd said nothing out of the ordinary, suggested alcohol involved. The tension between belief and denial ran through every decade. Families who lost loved ones often refused to speak or grew angry when asked. Others confided reluctantly, confessing that silence felt safer, as though words themselves could draw the voices nearer. Teenagers and the chapel ruins. By the 1980s, the legend of the drowned choir had become a rite of passage for local teens. The chapel's stone foundation still lingered on the floodplain, moss-choked and half-sunk. Children dared one another to spend a night there. The stories that came back were always the same. A sound like faint music under the ground, the sensation of being watched. Dreams of water rising through the floorboards. Some claimed to wake with their clothes damp, though no rain had fallen. Others swore they saw pale figures between the trees, just at the edge of vision. A local boy, interviewed anonymously in a school project, described it like this. We all went down there with flashlights around midnight. Jake started humming, swore he didn't mean to. Said the song just popped in his head. We shoved him, told him to stop, but he looked blank, like he wasn't there. We dragged him back to the car. He didn't remember it the next day. Stories like these spread through each new generation, a mix of bravado and fear, yet behind the exaggeration lay a consistent thread, the hem that no one recognized, always returning, always incomplete. Fragmented voices. One striking detail repeated across witnesses, the way the singing never sounded whole. Fishermen, hikers, even farmers tending fields near the river described the same phenomenon. They would hear fragments, half a melody, a single verse, a rising note that never resolved. It's like trying to catch smoke, said Michael Hardy, who lived near the old ferry dock. You almost know the tune, but it slips. And then you catch yourself humming along before you realize it. The humming, whether in sleep, in play, or by accident, was what unsettled witnesses most. They feared that once the song found you, it didn't let go. The weight of silence. For every person willing to speak, 10 more remained quiet. Families of the missing, in particular, resisted questions. Some turned away reporters at their doors. Others demanded the subject be dropped in church halls and town meetings. The fear was not only grief, it was contagious. The sense that to speak of the drowned choir too freely was to invite it closer. One widow, whose husband vanished in 1945, said only this: "The river takes who it wants. Don't give it reason to notice you." Paranormal rumors. As the decades wore on, rumors layered over fact. Some said the choir's final hymn could be recorded on certain nights if you left a tape recorder by the chapel ruins. Others claimed you could summon the voices by singing in unison near the levee at midnight. Skeptics pointed out that no clear recordings had ever surfaced, only tapes filled with static, muffled tones that might have been wind or frogs or faulty equipment. But believers swore they heard harmonies buried inside the noise, voices rising where none should be. Folklorists noted how the stories echoed older traditions. Water spirits, drowned souls calling others to join them. But here, the details remained curiously consistent. The humming, the layered voices, the neat belongings left behind. By the end of the 20th century, the parish had accumulated nearly a century of stories, fragments of testimony, rumors, contradictions. Some spoke with conviction, describing the voices as if they had heard them yesterday. Others dismissed the tales as foolishness. Yet even the skeptics admitted a discomfort walking by the river alone at night. Taken together, the witnesses form a chorus, discordant, unreliable, but undeniable. A song half heard, half forgotten, threading through generations. And in that chorus, one refrain repeats: "If you hear the hymn, don't hum along." The investigators. By the 1970s, America had entered its age of hauntings. The popularity of paranormal research was on the rise. Books about ghosts lined shelves. College students experimented with Ouija boards, and television specials promised to reveal true hauntings caught on camera. St. Augustine Parish, quiet and unassuming, found itself pulled into this cultural tide. The story of the drowned choir, once whispered only within families and sermons, drew the attention of investigators from outside the parish. What had once been a local grief began to be treated as a case, an unsolved mystery, to be cracked with tape recorders, cameras, and seances. The first recordings. In 1972, a group calling themselves the Louisiana Society for Psychic Research visited the ruins of the old chapel. They carried reel-to-reel recorders, bulky cameras, and notebooks filled with transcriptions of alleged hauntings across the state. Their official report, published in a small circulation newsletter, describes ambient voices captured on tape. At 2:14 a.m., investigators noted a faint choral sound, low and indistinct. Playback revealed layered voices, tonal but without clear words. Subjective impression was of a hymn, though unidentifiable. The recordings still exist in a university archive. Scholars who later reviewed them were unimpressed, dismissing the sounds as frogs, insects, or distortion from the river breeze. But among believers, the recordings spread quickly. Cassette tubs circulated in paranormal circles, each generation of copies fuzzier, the voices more buried in static. Listeners leaned in close, swearing they heard harmonies where none should be. Scholars versus psychics. The 1970s and 1980s brought clashing interpretations. Scholars and Louisiana universities often dismissed the accounts as folk panic. One folklorist, Dr. Martin Givens, published an article in 1978 arguing that the drowned choir legend was simply a communal memory of tragedy, reanimated through oral tradition. He likened it to banshee stories in Ireland or the Bell Witch of Tennessee, grief transformed into haunting. There was no evidence, he wrote, that anything supernatural occurred in St. Augustine Parish. What exists is evidence of trauma, preserved in song and repeated until it hardens into legend. Psychics, however, claimed otherwise. A self-proclaimed medium named Clara Delacroix visited the site in 1981 and later gave a televised interview. The choir never stopped singing, she said. They drowned, but the hymn carried them over. They still sing in the water, in the fog, in the dreams of those who listen. If you hum, you open the door. Her words struck a chord. They spread far beyond the parish, appearing in magazine articles, quoted in pulp paperbacks about America's most haunted sites. The tension between skepticism and belief only deepened the story's hold. The case of 1989. The most infamous event in the investigators' era occurred in the summer of 1989. Two amateur researchers from Baton Rouge, Daniel Miller, age 24, and Patrick Harris, age 26, drove into St. Augustine Parish on July 9th. Friends said they were fascinated by the drowned choir legend, eager to capture their own evidence. They carried a single cassette recorder, a camera, and camping supplies. They never returned. The search party found their car parked near the levee. Their tent was pitched by the old chapel foundation, sleeping bags unrolled. But the men themselves were gone. The only trace was the cassette recorder, discovered half buried in mud by the river's edge. The tape inside was jammed, reels warped by moisture. When police technicians pried it free, they discovered 32 minutes of audio. The first portion contained ordinary sound. Conversation between the men, laughter, the whine of mosquitoes, then faintly something else, layered tones, indistinct, like many voices singing far away. The men grew quiet on tape. One said, "You hear that?" Another laughed nervously. "It's nothing. Frogs." But the recording captured the sound growing louder, voices weaving into one another. Static surged, drowning words. The last audible fragment is a voice, unclear whether it belongs to one of the men or something else, humming a melody, then silence. The tape. The Harris-Miller tape became the centerpiece of debate. To believers, it was proof. The drowned choir had been caught on tape, their hymn preserved. To skeptics, it was merely evidence of faulty equipment and suggestible minds. The families of the men refused interviews, but one relative told reporters they wouldn't just walk off. Something called them. The parish sheriff's office closed the case as presumed drowned. No bodies were ever found. The tape, meanwhile, circulated like contraband. Copies passed from hand to hand, always degraded, always filled with static. But every so often, listeners swore they heard a phrase, a harmony, a rising note that lodged in their memory. The folklore solidifies. By the 1990s, the drowned choir was no longer just a local legend. It had entered the wider canon of American hauntings. True Crime magazine published lurid spreads about the vanishing choir of St. Augustine. Paranormal radio hosts played clips of the 1989 tape, encouraging listeners to call in with what they heard. Within the parish, however, the reaction was quieter, darker. Families urged silence more than ever. Ministers issued stern warnings, and a refrain emerged, passing from mouth to mouth, scrawled on bathroom stalls, whispered in locker rooms. If you hear the hum, don't hum along. The warning became the central feature of the folklore. The song was not only a ghostly echo, but an invitation. To hum was to answer, to cross a threshold you might never return from. The divide. The age of investigation left a deep divide in its wake. On one side were the believers, psychics, paranormal researchers, thrill seekers. They treated the drowned choir as a haunting to be documented, captured, even monetized. On the other side were the locals, farmers, shopkeepers, parishioners. For them it was not spectacle, but shadow, a presence woven into their history. They wanted no cameras, no investigators, just silence and distance. One local man put it plainly in a 1992 interview. Outsiders come for a story. We live with it. They can take their tapes and leave. We can't. The legacy of the investigators. The 1970s and 1980s did not solve the mystery of the drowned choir. If anything, they complicated it, layering folklore over evidence, static over silence. But they gave the legend permanence. With each investigator's visit, with each tape copied and recopied, the story grew roots beyond the parish. The Harris Miller disappearance sealed it. After 1989, few dared to spend a night at the chapel ruins. Even thrill-seeking teenagers thought twice, and always the refrain remained, "Don't hum along." Closing note. Looking back, the investigator era reads like a chorus itself. Skeptics, believers, psychics, locals, all voices clashing, layered, indistinct. No single line stands alone. Together they form the shape of a hymn no one recognizes, but everyone remembers. The drowning may have been swept away in 1912, but through microphones, memories, and whispers, their story endured, and the river listened. The modern pattern. By the turn of the millennia, nearly 90 years had passed since the flood of 1912. The story of the drowned choir had traveled far, passed between ghost hunting magazines, paranormal talk radio, and light night campfire dares. Yet in St. Augustine Parish, the legend was not entertainment. It was a presence woven into the rhythms of daily life, a shadow that stretched forward every 11 years. And true to its rhythm, the pattern continued. 2000, The Schoolboy. On April 6, 2000, Thomas Green, age 13, failed to return home from school. His friends last saw him walking along Willow Creek, a shortcut he often took. A neighbor recalled watching him from her porch. He was whistling or humming, not anything I knew. Not a tune from the radio, it sounded older, like something you'd hear in church, but not any church I've been to. Thomas's backpack was found propped against a tree, lunch uneaten inside. His sneakers were discovered a day later, lined up neatly at the creek's edge. Search dogs picked up his trail along the water, then lost it abruptly. The sheriff's office recorded the case as presumed accidental drowning, though no body was ever found. His parents, interviewed years later, remembered the weeks before his disappearance differently. He kept saying he heard music, his mother told a reporter, at night when he was supposed to be asleep. He said there was singing under his window. I thought it was a dream. I told him to stop scaring himself. Now I wonder if he was trying to warn me. 2011, The Jogger. 11 years later, on May 19, 2011, Rachel Alvarez, 34, went for an evening run along the levee. She never came back. Witnesses saw her jogging, earbuds dangling around her neck. She wasn't listening to anything, a cyclist told deputies. She was humming, loud, like she was trying to remember a tune. I even joked about it. Said she needed a radio. She just smiled and kept running. Rachel's phone and keys were found on the levee. Her running shoes were on the bank, placed side by side, as if she had stopped to remove them deliberately. Her husband described nights before her disappearance, when she woke suddenly, saying she'd heard singing in the walls. He dismissed it as stress, insomnia, an overactive imagination. But he remembered her final words before leaving for that last run. Maybe if I hum along, it'll stop. 2022. The Fisherman. The most recent case occurred on July 2nd, 2022. Marcus Lee, 42, set out to night fish on the river, a hobby he'd kept since childhood. At 3 a.m., his boat was found adrift, nets half cast, tackle box open. The only sign of Marcus was a single boot wedged under a seat. His family reported that he had been restless in the days before, humming to himself constantly. He said he heard music when he closed his eyes, his brother explained. Said it was beautiful, like a choir. But he also said it scared him, because it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his head. The parish sheriff once again ruled it a presumed drowning, but locals, unsurprised, shook their heads. It was the 11th year, one woman said. Everyone knew something was coming. The families. Interviews with surviving families reveal a consistent thread of grief tangled with guilt. Parents, siblings, and spouses confess that they dismissed warnings, brushed off strange behaviors as dreams or nerves. A mother recalls her son waking at 2 a.m. to say, "The river was singing." A husband remembers his wife humming a melody she couldn't explain. A brother said he found his sibling scribbling fragments of musical notes on paper, though he'd never studied music. Each family describes the same helpless pattern. First the hearing, then the humming, then the disappearance. They all thought it was in their heads, said one grieving father. But what if it wasn't? Communal fear. In response to the growing pattern, the parish has taken visible precautions. The old floodplain, once a gathering place for children and teens, is now fenced off with chain link. Signs warn trespassers of unstable ground and sudden flooding. Locals know the real reason, to keep curious souls away from the chapel ruins. Every April, near the anniversary of the 1912 flood, the town holds a vigil. Families carry lanterns to the levee, lining them along the bank as the dusk falls. They read aloud the names of the drowned choir, along with the names of every person who has disappeared since. Children are warned not to sing during the vigil. Hymns are forbidden in church that week. Even humming in jest is met with sharp reprimand. One pastor, interviewed privately, admitted, "We forbid hymns not because we don't believe, but because we do." Layered voices. Despite precautions, residents continue to report experiences they can't explain. A retired teacher wakes at night, convinced she hears a choir through her bedroom walls. A farmer claims he heard singing in his barn, though no one was there. Multiple households along the river say they sometimes hear music rising from the floodwater, faint but persistent, like a radio caught between stations. One woman described it vividly. "It's never a full song, it's bits and pieces, like someone practicing, but if you listen long enough, it becomes harmony. Not one voice, not two, many. Like the choirs still rehearsing, waiting for the flood to finish the hymn." Skeptics dismiss these accounts as imagination, stress, or the suggestive power of folklore, but for those who hear it, the effect is undeniable. Several residents confessed that they sometimes find themselves humming afterward without realizing it. The realization fills them with dread. "It's not just hearing it," one man says, "it's carrying it. Like the song, it gets into you." The shape of the pattern. What began as a tragic flood in 1912 has become a century-long rhythm of loss, Every 11 years, someone in St. Augustine Parish disappears. Each case is eerily similar. The humming. Witnesses recall the missing person murmuring or singing a melody unknown to them. The belongings. Shoes, jackets, backpacks, always placed neatly near water. The silence. No body ever recovered. The families mourn. The parish prays, and the cycle repeats. Living with it. For St. Augustine Parish, the drowned choir is not a story told to frighten children. It is part of life. As predictable as seasons, every 11th year, people grow cautious. Parents forbid children from playing near the river. Teens resist the urge to test the legend. Families mark calendars with dread. And still, the song comes. The present tense. As of 2025, the next 11th year looms only 8 years away. Some believe the cycle is accelerating, that the 2022 disappearance may not hold the line. Others whisper that the drowned are growing louder, their songs swelling with each new voice added to the choir. One folklorist who visited recently said, "It's not just a haunting, it's a liturgy, a ritual with its own rhythm. Every 11 years, the parish sings a verse, and the hymn goes on." For the families of the lost, such words bring no comfort. For them, the song is not metaphor, but memory. Something half heard through walls, something that carries their loved ones away. The river still listens. In late 2023, residents reported a new phenomenon. After a heavy storm, several families near Willow Creek claimed they heard music rising from the floodwaters. Not faint, not indistinct, but clear. Layered harmonies, as though a choir rehearsed in the distance. One teenager recorded the sound on his phone. The clip, passed around online, is mostly wind and rain. But buried in the noise, some swear they hear voices. Whether true or imagined, the effect was the same. Fear rippled through the parish. Parents warned children not to listen too closely. Ministers remind congregants of the old refrain, "If you hear the hymn, don't hum along." The return of the song. There comes a point in every investigation when research and testimony are no longer enough. Pages blur, recordings grow indistinct, and the only way forward is to stand in the place itself. So one night, in October of last year, I brought my equipment to the ruins of the old chapel. The setting. The foundation lies hidden in the floodplain, behind rusting chain link and sagging signs warning of unstable ground. The stone blocks are moss-choked, half sunk into the earth that drinks water faster than it gives it back. Locals avoid the place, even during the day. It feels abandoned in a way that goes deeper than neglect, as though the land itself has grown tired of hosting footsteps. I arrived just after dusk, armed with a digital recorder, a DSLR camera, and a simple EMF meter, tools of the trade, borrowed from both journalism and ghost hunting. I told myself I was there to observe, not to believe. But the silence as I crossed the fence felt different, heavy, like a room waiting for someone to speak first. First phenomena. At 9:12 p.m., I placed the recorder on the crumbling stone of what had once been the chapel's north wall. The night was still, crickets muted, the river a faint hiss beyond the trees. When I replayed the first minutes of tape later, there was nothing unusual, just wind, the faint sound of my footsteps. But beginning at the 7-minute mark, a hum bled into the track, not present in the moment, but etched into the recording. It was faint at first, tonal, like a low organ note. Then it grew, layering with itself, as though multiple voices were finding harmony. The effect was unsettling, indistinct yet ordered, too structured to be mere static. At the time, I heard nothing. The photographs. The camera told a similar story. I snapped dozens of shots across the ruins, the leaning trees, the broken stones, the sky thick with clouds. In the moment, the images look ordinary. Later, reviewing them, I found distortions. In several frames, faint figures lingered in the background, smudges of pale gray, human in outline but blurred, as though they stood in motion. In one photo, taken toward the river, I counted 27 shapes, the same number as the drowned. The encountered. I had been warned repeatedly. Witnesses, pastors, even grieving families said the same thing. If you hear the hymn, don't hum along. But warnings grow thin in silence. Sitting among the stones, listening to nothing but the soft lapping of water, I found myself thinking of the fragments I'd read, the musical notes scribbled in notebooks, the hummed phrases caught on tape. The melody came unbidden, a rise, a fall, incomplete but insistent. I hummed a single bar. The air changed instantly. The silence thickened, as though the night had taken a breath. The hair on my arms rose, and beneath the quiet I heard it, not with my ears, but in the space between them. Voices, layered, countless, weaving together, some high, some low, all carrying a harmony so dense it felt physical, pressing against my chest. The hymn was not in the air, it was in me, vibrating through marrow and muscle. I stopped humming. The voices continued. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. The night was only night again. The psychological creep. I packed my equipment and left before midnight, shaken but composed. It was only afterward, days later, that the real unease set in. At first it was small, a faint tune while brushing my teeth, a rhythm that slipped into idle whistling. I didn't recognize it until it was halfway out of my mouth. The hymn. I would wake in the night, convinced someone was humming in the next room. No one was there. I played white noise to sleep, still under the static. The melody threaded itself, incomplete but insistent. Friends noticed. They asked why I hummed so much, what the song was. I said I didn't know. I told myself it was suggestion, the mind replaying what it expected to hear, that explanations are always simpler than we imagine. But even now, as I write this, I feel the weight of it pressing in, a hymn that doesn't end, a song without words, a chorus that never stops listening for its next voice. And I wonder if by answering, I have already joined it. The Hymn That Never Ends. On April 14th of 2023, the 111th anniversary of the flood, families gathered at the levee for the annual vigil. They carried lanterns, dozens of them, glowing orange against the night. Each bore the name of someone lost, the 27 of 1912, and every disappearance since. One by one, the names were read aloud. Children fidgeted, parents wept quietly, elders stood with heads bowed. At the end, a single phrase closed the list. They are not forgotten. The lanterns were set adrift, bobbing gently along the current, small lights swallowed by the blackness of the river. For a moment the scene was still, reverent. Then faintly someone said they heard singing, not from the crowd, not from the living, from the water. The reflection, the next 11th year, 2033, is not far off. For some, this is a date marked in dread. For others, it has already begun. The families say the hymn is louder now, more insistent. Some children hum fragments without knowing why. Others wake at night with voices in their ears. It may be that the cycle is accelerating, that the drowned are gathering strength, or perhaps the truth is simpler. Once you know the song, you can't unhear it. Either way, the hymn never ends. If you want to hear more Unholy Case Files like this one, subscribe. And remember, whatever you do, don't hum along.